One could argue that borders have been around since humans first began to settle in fixed locations, claiming that location as their own. As humans moved from hunter-gatherers to agrarian societies, they began marking land over which they believed to have exclusive use. These lines of ownership or borders could exist only in one's mind, meaning that this is what this person or group of people believe to be theirs, accepted by others outside their border based on physical features of the earth or barriers such as primitive fences or walls to mark their land. Today, borders are most commonly thought of as a divide between political entities, usually between countries. Just like in early times, these borders can be imaginary, exist only in the mind of the certain individuals, borders that have been agreed upon and demonstrated by lines on a map based on conquest, threat, or agreements with others, natural physical features, or walls or other means of marking territory. Regardless of what form a border takes, accepted borders have become symbols of national sovereignty. Just like early man, areas of exclusive control. Borders represent national sovereignty that needs to be protected and controlled for maintaining that country's sovereignty. Therefore, border security is an important component of any country's national security. Borders take many different shapes and states and sizes. Borders can exist between friendly nations, as between the United States and Canada, hostile nations, as between Pakistan and India, where there have been nearly constant border skirmishes for nearly 6 decades. They can be designed to keep people out, such as the Great Wall of China, or they can be designed to keep people in, like the Berlin Wall. Borders can be heavily fortified, such as the borders between North and South Korea, or can have no impediment to travel, such as the existing borders between most countries within the European Union. In this picture, you are seeing the border between the Netherlands and Belgium. In short, the nature of borders are as diverse as the nations that they carve out on the world map. It mostly depends on how one country views its borders. Should borders be strongly fortified that are meant to keep people and goods out, or are they soft, allowing for the free flow of people and trade between nations? If a country's goal is a hardened border that is difficult to cross, nature can often provide the best borders because they are inherently difficult to cross. Geography has long been a barrier that has separated people into separate groups. Thousands of years later, these barriers still exist to separate these same people, both physically and politically, as despite advancements in technology, they are still difficult to cross. Mountains can be seen as one of the most difficult natural barriers to traverse. The Himalayan mountains have separated people since the dawn of man and has historically acted as a near impenetrable barrier between East Asia and South Asia. Finding and controlling routes through the Himalayas have long been a political, military, and economic goal that has been difficult to achieve, and even today these mountains remain a physical and political border separating China from Pakistan and India and several other countries. The Alps have long served as an impressive physical border in Europe. The Alps has allowed for Switzerland to maintain independence, political neutrality since 1291, and Switzerland has not been in a state of war since 1812. This despite the fact that during this time there has been a state of near constant hostility all around them, including 2 world wars in the last century alone. Bodies of water have also served as an important physical barrier that separates people and established political borders. While rivers depend on their size, having served as both barriers and borders over the centuries, advancements in technology have rendered their roles as physical barriers less important, but remain an important physical marker between various political entities. Large bodies of water, however, have remained an important physical barrier. The United States, throughout its history, benefited strategically from the fact that vast oceans on two sides protected it. Today, despite being a member of the European Union, the English Channel has separated Great Britain from the European continent. This has allowed Britain to implement many policies separate from the EU, including maintaining border controls between itself and the rest of the continent. Ironically, with advancements in maritime technology having historically served as a means of circumventing physical barriers for economic, political, and military purposes, culminating in the age of exploration, bodies of water now serve as a dual purpose, as many of our waters today serve as conduits of trade and a means of protection. In fact, oceans and seas of the world quickly become indispensable to growing the economic and political power of nations. Countries like Spain and Great Britain developed powerful navies to colonize the globe. These navies also serve as an essential role in maintaining order on the high seas and security and control at ports around the world. In short, they are tools designed to provide maritime and transportation security. Even today, navies and coast guards remain vital to maintaining international trade and maritime security on the high seas. This is not to say that large bodies of waters do not remain formidable barriers. For proof of this, one needs to look no further than Australia and New Zealand, two large island nations that have never been invaded. But not all nations have the benefit of physical barriers to fortify their borders. Sometimes they establish on agreed-upon borders by separate parties. Civilization really started when people began to develop a sense of community with other people, and a sense of community developed. Usually this was based on shared language, ethnicity, religion, or other social bonds. Joining together allowed them to pool their resources as a means of economic opportunity as well as security. Over time, they formed norms that governed society that eventually gave way to some sort of political institution or code of law. Borders were not necessarily fixed, but were more a product of how much area a political institution controlled. Often this ability to exert control over an area would encroach on other communities. This would result either in the two groups agreeing upon demarcations of where one group territory ended and the other began, or more commonly, it would result in conflict between the two groups. The result would often be one group's territory expanding while another group's receded or completely lost it altogether, and being absorbed into its former neighbor's area of territorial control. As groups began to expand their power, it eventually led to the development of empires. Eventually, the area that given political institution could control would reach its peak, and eventually begin to recede or break apart into smaller political units. This is a cycle that played out over several millennia right up until today. This is a topic that will be covered in more detail in the next section, but what is important to understand is that borders between countries have always been not just about natural boundaries, but about political boundaries. Many of today's borders are the result of formal agreements between two or more states. These formal agreements, usually in the form of treaties that end wars, attempt to maintain peace, form alliances, improve commerce, or even selling of land, in which could be considered real estate transaction between nations. In one of the strangest redrawings of borders, Queen Victoria, the monarch of the United Kingdom, who controlled the British colony of Kenya, gave Mount Kilimanjaro to her grandson as a birthday present. Her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, received Mount Kilimanjaro. As a result, Kilimanjaro and the surrounding lands became part of German East Africa, which is in modern-day Tanzania. The birthday gift still defines the borders between these two countries today. Today, borders between countries are not necessarily the result of one specific agreement, but often evolve over time as a result of numerous treaties and agreements. The U.S.-Canadian border is a perfect example of this.
Sister nations get along fairly well. They both want to make it really clear whose side of the continent is whose, and they've done this by carving a 20-foot wide space along the border, all 5,500 miles of it. With the exception of the rare New England town that predates national borders or the odd airport that needed expanding, this space is the no-touching zone between the countries, and they're super serious about keeping it clear. It matters not if the no-touching zone runs through hundreds of miles of virtually uninhabited Alaskan Yukon wilderness, those border trees will not stand. Which might make you think this must be the longest, straightest, deforested place in the world, but it isn't. Deforested, yes, but straight, not at all. Sure, it looks straight on a map, and the treaties establishing the line say it's straight, but in the real world, the official border is 900 lines that zigzag from the horizontal by as much as several hundred feet. How did this happen? Well, imagine you're back in North America in the 1800s. The 49th parallel, one of those horizontal lines you see on the globe, has just been set as the national boundary, and it's your job to make it real. You are handed a compass and a ball of string and told to carefully mark off the next 2/3 of a continent. Don't mind that uncharted wilderness in your way, just keep the line straight. Yeah, good luck with that. The men who surveyed the land did the best they could and built over 900 monuments. They're in about as straight a line as you could expect a pre-GPS civilization to make, but it's not the kind of spherical planar intersection that would bring a mathematician joy. Nonetheless, these monuments define the border, and the no-touching zone plays connect the dots with them. Oh, and while there are about 900 markers along this section of the border, there are about 8,000 in total that define the shape of the nations. Despite this massive project, Canada and the United States still have disputed territory. There's a series of islands in the Atlantic that the United States claims are part of Maine, and Canada claims are part of New Brunswick. Canada, assuming the islands are hers, built a lighthouse on one of them, and the United States, assuming the islands are hers, pretends the lighthouse doesn't exist. It's not a huge problem, as the argument is mostly over tourists who want to see puffins and fishermen who want to catch lobsters, but let's hope the disagreement gets resolved before someone finds oil under that lighthouse. Even the non-disputed territory has a few notably weird spots, such as this tick of the border upward into Canada. Zoom in and it gets stranger, as the border isn't over solid land, but runs through a lake to cut off a bit of Canada before diving back down to the US. This spot is home to about 100 Americans and is a perfect example of how border irregularities are born. Back in 1783, when the victorious Americans were negotiating with the British, who controlled what would one day be Canada, they needed a map, and this map was the best available at the time. While the East Coast looks pretty good, the wester it goes, the sparser it gets. Under negotiation was the edge of what would one day be Minnesota and Manitoba, but unfortunately that area was hidden underneath an inset on the map, so the Americans and the British were bordering blind. Seriously. They guessed the border should start from the northwestern part of this lake and go in a horizontal line until it crossed the Mississippi. Somewhere. But somewhere turned out to be nowhere, as the mighty Mississippi stopped short of that line, which left the border vague until 35 years later, when a second round of negotiations established the aforementioned 49th parallel. But there was still a problem, as the lake mentioned earlier was both higher and less circular than first thought, putting its northwesterly point here, so the existing border had to jump up to meet it and then drop straight down to the 49th, awkwardly cutting off a bit of Canada before heading west to the remainder of the continent. And it turns out you can't just draw a straight-ish line for hundreds of miles without causing a few more problems, one of which was luckily spotted in advance: Vancouver Island, which the 49th would have sliced through, but both sides agreed that would be dumb, so the border swoops around the island. However, next door to Vancouver Island is Point Roberts, which went unnoticed, and thus today the border blithely cuts across. It's a nice little town home to over 1,000 Americans, but has only a primary school, so its older kids have to cross international borders 4 times a day to go to school in their own state. In a pleasing symmetry, the East Coast has the exact opposite situation, separation with a Canadian island whose only land route is a bridge from the United States. And these two aren't the only places where each country contains a bit of the other. There are several more, easily spotted in satellite photos by the no-touching zone. Regardless of if the land in question is just an uninhabited strip in the middle of a lake in the middle of nowhere, the border between these sister nations must remain clearly marked. Hello Internet. If you're a super map geek like me, you can click on the link on the side and you can go to my website and download a Google Earth file that I put together that contains all 8,000 markers for the official border between Canada and the United States. It makes for some pretty interesting Google Earth browsing if you're the kind of person who's really interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, it's there if you want it, so go nuts.
Canada and the United States share the longest border between two countries in the world, and most of it is unguarded. But as you saw in the video, this border did not come into existence overnight, and despite our friendly relationship, there are still border disputes between the two countries, and a need to define where exactly the border lies. In short, borders are not based on natural barriers, and in some cases, even when they are, political borders are fragile in nature. For this reason, many countries feel the need to fortify their borders with artificial barriers to prevent or limit unwanted incursions across their border. The most common artificial border between nations are walls. Walls are erected to prevent or deter individuals, groups of people, and even foreign forces from crossing a nation's border altogether, or are designed to funnel legal border crossings through a checkpoint or point of entry set up at a specific location. Probably the best known example of a wall being erected to delineate a border and deter unwanted crossings is the Great Wall of China, whose construction began before 2000 BC. As ancient a strategy as wall building is, in some cases, it has provided an effective and is still employed today. Israelis have built a wall surrounding Jewish settlements within the primary Palestinian West Bank. While the U.S. has several natural barriers between itself and Mexico, in those areas devoid of natural barriers, efforts to construct walls of various types have been tried to stem the flow of illegal goods and people across the border. Walls are often not the only type of artificial border used to fortify borders. All other types of barriers include fences, armed patrols, air and marine patrols. Increasingly, technology is being implemented either in lieu of artificial barriers or to augment both artificial and natural barriers. These include such measures as motion sensors, thermal image cameras, and even unmanned aerial vehicles, all of which can be monitored remotely by users who can dispatch a response team to deal with the unwanted border incursion. In conclusion, a country's border defines the area which they have sovereignty. The ability to control and regulate what crosses over the border into that country's territory is critical to that country maintaining its sovereignty. For this reason, border security has emerged as an important national security concern. The level of security placed at a border around the world varies greatly and usually depends on the nature of one's relationship with its neighbors. Levels of security can range from the free flow of goods, people, and services across national borders, as exists in most of Western Europe, and the carving out of the 20 feet no-touching zone that exists between the United States and Canada, the demilitarized zone that exists between North Korea and is secured on both sides with armed patrols and heavily fortified fences and walls, even landmines and listening posts. But in reality, the level of security that a country decides to implement to protect its border and national sovereignty is actually an example of national sovereignty. At this time, I'd ask that you go to the discussion post for Section 2 of this course and answer the questions being asked.